Hello there, everyone, and welcome back to the channel, Russia in Context. Back once again, going to fill you in on all of what's been happening here in Russia over this last week. If you watched the last video about the floods here in Russia, then you probably already know the main story is going to be about the floods. That situation has not been resolved, and it has, in fact, kind of gotten worse. In most of the areas with flooding, there has been record water levels seen, again, pretty much everywhere. And with record levels of flooding, of course, we're going to see massive amounts of damage. We got some first estimates this week, specifically with the Orenburgskaya oblast, which the estimate for damage is around 40 billion rubles. Obviously, with other regions and the damages that are going to be there, that total, when everything is added together, is going to be significantly higher. We may be looking at over 100 billion rubles worth of damage across the affected regions. One thing that I did notice over this last week, though, was that when they were talking about coverage of what was happening with the flooding situation, maybe I'm watching the wrong channels, maybe I missed it somehow, but I didn't see a lot of coverage of sandbagging efforts, people handing out supplies. It was mostly just this slow, gradual creep of the water. I'm sure people were out there fighting back and doing what they could to save their homes and their businesses. But I thought it was kind of interesting that from all of the floods that I've experienced in the States, I always remember that community effort of the people banding together, sandbagging, and just getting people out of there, working together. That was always one of the main focuses, especially in the news, not just local but national as well. And I haven't really seen much of that here, which I felt was a bit odd. I'm sure it's been happening. It just has felt odd that there hasn't been more focus on it. I also want to follow up on something from last week when I mentioned that there had only been one report of looting. That's not the case. Over the course of this last week, through multiple reporters writing essays and actual video accounts by local residents, especially in the Orenburgskaya oblast, it turns out looting is a much more serious problem. In fact, the federal government has sent in additional, officers or sent down additional orders to patrol areas by boat, evidently, to make sure that looting is not continuing. So I was maybe preemptive last week when I said that there was only one looter that they had seen, and that was just because nobody wanted to do it. Because evidently that's not the case. There were plenty of interested parties to partake in looting. I've also been talking about Orenburgskaya oblast quite a bit, but recently in the last few days here, starting around Friday, the 12th, the focus has slowly started to shift towards Kurganskaya oblast, at least from what I've been seeing and reading, mainly because in Orenburgskaya oblast, the waters, especially in the most heavily affected town of Orsk, have slowly been receding. I think in the capital city of Orenburg, the waters are still maybe rising a little bit, but it's not anything too horrible. They had to evacuate, though, one of those massive apartment complexes because the waters did reach to that. But I do think overall in that region, the situation is it's getting better. Whereas in Kurganskaya oblast, the situation is getting worse. Waters are rising really quickly there from what I've seen. And they're also moving very, very quickly. So it looks like the focus for this next week is going to shift further east in the country, but the flooding will remain. Now, the big thing around the flooding, at least this week, has been not so much the damage that it has done, but the government's response to the flooding. What I mean by that is it just hasn't been very good. Early in the week, a local minister from the Orenburgskaya oblast released a press statement where he recommended that residents in areas that were going to be affected by flooding, that they stockpile, specifically a month's supply of water and food. Now, food, realistically, you could stockpile, I suppose, a month's worth of food for a person. That's more or less okay if you have the money to do so. Water, however, is a little bit more complicated, and a Russian journalist actually sat down and did some calculations and came to a number, which I don't have it directly in front of me, but this is what I remember, that without considering washing, so just enough water to theoretically like do your basic bathroom necessities and also drink, for a month, a person requires 7 bathtubs full of water. So the message of just have a month's worth of food and water per person is not only tone deaf from the government, but also completely insane. And this is just one example of like some not great PR moves on local government part during this crisis. Another example, and one that had the potential maybe to not get out of control, but become unpleasant, was that with the town of Orsk, which I've mentioned last week and just a little bit ago, the town that was most heavily affected by the flooding, at least at this point in time, a group of residents gathered in front of the local administrative building, and they demanded to meet with government officials. And they were warned in advance by the state prosecutors that any unsanctioned meetings might see them prosecuted in the state. So not only had these people lost all of their homes, maybe not all of their homes, but large portions of their property, but now they were being threatened by the state with gathering and demanding some sort of answers from their, non-elected officials, because there's no voting for governors and mayors and stuff like that. But regardless, the state-appointed officials, they had no right to demand anything from them. Basically met with a wall full of police officers who, again, weren't doing anything to help them in this disaster situation, but were instead guarding the state authorities. Again, not a great look. Pretty bad, in fact. However, the government eventually did listen to their demands, and a meeting with the governor of Orenburgskaya oblast, Denis Pasler, was arranged. However, this didn't really make the situation any better. When they finally did have the meeting, the governor, Pasler, spoke with them kind of rudely. He later said that he was tired, and that's fine. But again, you're the governor. You're supposed to treat these people with respect, and this is a trying time for everybody. But the thing that caught a lot of people's attention, and this is very, very common with government officials, is that he was adamant that everybody have their phones put away. Typically, this is done because the state officials then do not want any non-state sanctioned recordings of what is said or what happens in these meetings. And so they just are, again, dead set on making sure nobody has their phones out, because they do not want any compromising situations to appear in the future. Not a great look. And yeah, just in general, the governor of Orenburgskaya oblast, when he finally did meet with these people, just treated them kind of like underlings. So just horrible handling on the PR department all the way down throughout the government here. On top of that, there's not even any attempt to maybe take responsibility for the situation. The current explanation for why the levees burst is not that they were poorly constructed or that maintenance hadn't been done properly, but now it seems as though the Russian authorities are attempting to shift blame to Kazakhstan, and they are saying that the Kazakh government did not do enough to manage floodwaters there, and so that problem eventually came downstream, which is how rivers work. So, if you have massive flooding happening upriver where, it's upriver and it's going to do what rivers do and go downriver, then I don't know how much you can blame the other country or other region for that. That's just how water works. So, I suppose the Russian government could try to take physics to court, but actually here they could probably win, I suppose. So that would be an interesting case to see. Regardless, Kazakhstan is still dealing with just a massive problem up there. They have had more than 100,000 people evacuated from their homes. So it's not as though there was just a tiny little flood up there and they let it get out of control and it came all the way down to Russia. The situation is more Kazakhstan got hit hard with flooding, and part of that did come downriver, as is to be expected. Speaking of the levee maintenance, statistics were discovered by, I believe, the Russian newspaper Kommersant this last week, which found out that in the city of Orsk, once again, where we've heard that name multiple times now, that the local authorities last year or the year before spent 167 times more money on landscaping the square in front of the administrative building than they did on levee maintenance. So I'm not an expert on levee maintenance, and I don't know how much that typically runs, so maybe I'm way off base here, but it may be Kommersant or whichever major Russian newspaper ran this article was attempting to make the Russian or local government look bad, but that's highly doubtful. Regardless, I do have a feeling that maintenance and landscaping in front of the administrative building probably doesn't require that much money, and when you live in a region of the country which is kind of famous for getting flooded, like this is not the first time in that part of the country where such floods have happened, although at the level that we're seeing now, it's the first time in a long time. Regardless, maybe some of that money, the vast amounts of money evidently which were spent on the square, maybe just a little bit of that could have been reappropriated to the levees. However, there was one proactive, I suppose you can call it, move that the government did make in attempting to fight back against the flood. They had, in a helicopter, a priest with an icon fly over the flooded areas and bless them or use the icon to push the water back. Yeah. Now, this is a pretty common practice in modern Russia, especially in the last, I would say, 4 years or so. The first time I remember this happening was during COVID, when one of the priests, one of the priests, we'll just say, in the Moscow region was put into a helicopter with an icon in holy water and flew a circle around Moscow to protect the city from COVID, which didn't work. And the priest who was part of this ritual, if I remember correctly, he got sick with COVID and potentially died. So for the priest who flew over the flood areas, I hope he can swim. Now, that said, the Russian Orthodox Church just today, here on Sunday, the 14th of April, released an announcement saying that not long after they flew over the flooded areas with the icon, the floodwaters began to recede. So I guess they did it. Good job. Good job, Russian Orthodox Church. You saved the day. So easy. So let's talk about compensation after the flood, and specifically government compensation. Now, the Russian government is offering all residents in the Orenburgskaya oblast a one-time payment of 20,000 rubles for everyone who was affected by the flood. And again, if I remember correctly, all displaced people will be getting, every single individual will be getting 10,000 rubles per month for the next half year, which will be used to help pay for food and possibly rent. Although in the city of Orsk, the government there did give free housing to those people who had to be evacuated. And also in Orsk, the people will not have to pay for their utilities and taxes for maybe the whole year. That I don't remember exactly, but they won't be having to pay utilities and taxes, at least for part of the year, which I guess is good because they won't have homes. And then in Orenburgskaya oblast, for all of the people whose homes were partially destroyed, which is a vague term, I'm not really sure how they're going to determine that, they will get a payment of 50,000 rubles per household. And then for homes that were completely destroyed, they will get 100,000 rubles per household. Now, you can run those figures through a calculator if you're interested, but if we assume that somebody's house was completely destroyed and they get the one-time payment and the food, total, right, from the low end of the spectrum of government payouts to the high end of the spectrum, you're looking at a range of about $1,000 to $2,000 per person. That's not too much, right? Now, I've seen a lot of people saying that, hey, it's still good that the government is giving them money, right? That realistically, these people should have had flood insurance. But I want to talk for a second about the United States because I'm kind of familiar with how floods in the United States have worked. I've seen many of them. In fact, I've never been directly affected by one, but have been relatively close to them. That's just kind of where, the part of the country that I grew up in, we see floods from time to time. And one of the things that the United States government has for citizens who live in areas that are in danger of flooding is they have the National Flood Insurance Program, which is basically government-sponsored flood insurance. And for about $700 per year, on average, you get coverage which will average out to about $52,000 if your house is destroyed. Now, again, I understand $52,000 is not enough to completely repair a house or even rebuild a house. But when we look at what is available for insurance here in Russia, there is no government flood insurance plan. So you have to go through private insurance companies. Okay. And I went ahead and I looked at what flood programs are available, or flood insurance programs are available here through private insurance companies, which is also hard too, because a lot of times they'll list flooding, but it is connected more to if you live in an apartment and your neighbor's pipes burst, right? So the type of flooding that is more localized and not like my entire house is underwater type of flooding. But okay, what I managed to find was that for about 20,000 rubles a year, you could get a payment of about 3 million rubles, which is pretty good. But, it's still not comparable to what is available in the States. That said, the levy was insured by the Sogaz insurance company, and it is possible that homeowners whose homes were destroyed in the flooding will get compensation of 750,000 rubles, which is significantly better than what is being put forth by the government, obviously. But that is a private insurance company, and so there's going to have to be a full investigation as to why the levee burst, and if the insurance company decides that the levee burst just due to kind of forces of nature, things that were out of anybody's control, then there will be no payout. And even if they do decide that the government or whoever else was responsible, or that it does warrant an insurance payment, then it could still take months to years before people begin to see their money. So yeah, it's going to be a very, very tough situation for all of those people there. And I really feel bad for everybody who was affected. I've also seen a lot of people try to use the excuse of they just shouldn't have built their houses in a floodplain. But that is the most smooth-brained just excuse or justification for why the government hasn't been, I guess, carrying its weight in this situation. I can't imagine a dumber take on that. They shouldn't have lived in a floodplain. Like, that is literally where so much of human civilization has lived since the dawn of time. Just so incredibly stupid, just infuriatingly stupid. I do want to make one last comparison between the Russian government aid and the U.S. government aid, and I'm going to specifically talk about the Road Home program, which is what the U.S. government used to basically give people just a lump sum of cash after Hurricane Katrina. Now, from what I've read and from what I understand about the Road Home program, it was not without its problems. It specifically did not do enough to help out the poor. So the wealthy benefited from that more than the poor. Surprise, surprise, obviously. But they also got tens of thousands, if I remember correctly off the top of my head, something like the average payout was around $63,500. And that was if the house is completely destroyed, it could have been more. Average payments, though, we understand that it's going to be a little bit higher. And for the poor, they probably would have been getting a little bit less money or a lot less money. Regardless, we're talking about very, very large sums of money on average being paid out. And why I'm bringing that up is that it was just the government just like straight up gave that money out to people who were affected, whose homes had been destroyed. So could the Russian government just give out money to people whose homes had been destroyed? I mean, yeah, why not? We've seen there's precedent for it in other countries. The reason I'm bringing this up again here is because the problem with Hurricane Katrina was the levees burst, and that was kind of on the government. And then here we have another situation where the levees burst, and realistically, this is also on the Russian government. And the reason I bring that this is on the Russian government is because they are the ones who projected and planned and contracted the construction of the levees. And then realistically, to some degree, or maybe to 100%, they are responsible for checking and maintaining said levees. It's also worth noting that the fact of a once-in-a-century type flood was not accounted for when constructing the levees. And such a once-in-a-century type flood has already happened less than a century ago. In fact, around the time of World War II, water levels in terms of flooding were basically at the same level that we're seeing in these regions of Russia today. So none of that was taken into account when constructing the levees, which is kind of, again, on the government. So regardless, enough about the flooding. It's been going on long enough, but it has been the major story of the week. And obviously now that the waters are starting to recede in the Orenburgskaya oblast, we will have to see what the aftermath looks like. The cleanup process will probably begin here in the next few days. So we'll have to see what happens in that situation. Obviously, there's going to be dead animals. There are going to be spikes in the rodent population. There's probably going to be an influx of diseases like cholera and other diseases that flourish in places with still standing water and dead animals. So the situation hopefully will get better quickly, but there are a lot of other factors that come in the wake of a flood that could cause additional consequences. Okay, now that we're done with the main story, we're going to shift off to economics. And the first thing I want to talk about is how when Western brands like Zara and Berkshire and other ones, specifically clothing is what we're talking about right now, when they left last year or in 2022, there was a void that was waiting to be filled. And last year, a slew of shops such as Mag, Ecru, and Dub, and other just idiotically named, I don't know if they're from Turkey or where exactly they're from, but anyway, they are just sort of Zara, Berkshire, that style knockoffs, I suppose you could say. When they came back in, there was a lot of hype about how they were just going to immediately fill that void and how they would immediately kind of just take over those niches and have no problems and that people would just immediately adopt them. Well, they reported a 5 billion ruble loss last year, which is not great. Obviously, it is their first year of business. So in this year and in the next financial year, things could turn around. But I have my doubts about that. So one is that I don't know how readily these brands have been adopted by Russians. Again, this is anecdotal evidence, but every time we go to like the big grocery store, Ashan, in our neighborhood, there is a Mag shop in that shopping center. Since the opening weekend when that store first opened, I don't think I've ever seen a single person in there. It doesn't matter if it's during the week. It doesn't matter if it's on the weekend. It is always a ghost town. And I don't know if this is, again, because of people just not wanting what is seen as perhaps a second-tier replacement, or if it's because of due to the financial situation the average Russian citizen finds themselves in these days, perhaps they're just not spending money on clothes like that anymore. We're going to talk a little bit about the financial situation, or of Russians here in just a little bit, but needless to say, it is not as rosy as the government paints it to be. Moving on, the Russian government is planning to introduce something, I suppose we could call it a tourist tax. Now, this already exists in St. Petersburg, in the Altai, Krasnodar, and I gotta check, Stavropol regions of the country. What this basically comes down to is when you go to visit these areas, you pay, I believe it's 100 rubles per person per night. It's honestly really not that much. And the reason, like these 4 regions that were listed are really quite popular with tourists. So it's a way for the government to just earn a little extra cash, which in theory should go back into developing tourism and making the infrastructure better, but almost certainly is not. However, the plan right now, or the discussion that's on the table, is to just introduce that across the entire country. So basically, it would effectively make traveling for Russian citizens only available if you're willing to pay the government. And I understand 100 rubles is not that much money. But evidently, the Kremlin has thought of that as well, too, because one of the plans that's being thrown around would be a payment of 3% of whatever your accommodation payment is. So if it is like 1,000 rubles per night, it's not very much. But most accommodations aren't 1,000 rubles per night, right? They're 5,000 or 6,000 rubles per night. We'll see what happens with this. Regardless, it's really not popular. I can't imagine in the States how people would react if they were told that, like, oh, well, if you're going to go visit, another state, you're going to have to pay us $2 per night. I just can't imagine that anybody would think that's a good idea. Okay, I just mentioned the situation with Russian citizens and their financial situation not long ago, and I want to read a mostly straight quote, but there's a bit of paraphrasing I'm going to do from the Russian newspaper Izvestiya Gazeta. So here's what they had to say. One of the paradoxes of the Russian economy is that prices continue to rise while officially the number of poor citizens continues to drop. This has found an explanation. As shown in the research of specialists from the Institute of Economics at the Russian Academy of Sciences, the updated methodology for counting poverty is constructed so that the level of absolute financial poverty, as it can be judged, is decreasing. Earlier, Rosstat reported that in 2023, 9.3% of Russia's population was below the poverty level, a historic minimum. By the measures of those same experts, who call for determining the poverty level according to the consumer's good basket, an approach that the authorities walked back from a few years ago, it would be more appropriate to figure that 10.8% of the Russian Federation's population sits below the poverty line. The difference between the official statistic and those experts is more than 2 million people. In short, what it's saying is that the Russian government, when they release statistics, are not being completely honest, which, again, governments do that. But the way that they manipulate these statistics, according to Izvestiya Gazeta and some experts at the Russian Academy of Sciences, is basically that they are not looking, what they're saying poverty is connected to the average cost of a basket of goods, right? And I'll be honest, they change out what items are in the basket of goods depending on inflation. A few years back, they switched out, 2 years ago from what I remember, they switched out something like buckwheat and they put in cabbage because the price of buckwheat was going on. Don't quote me on that I don't remember exactly what the products were, but they will switch and swap items in the consumer's good basket in or out depending on how the inflation of prices of those specific goods is going. So they're able to artificially keep the price of consumers' goods baskets low when in fact the goods that citizens are actually buying, the inflation of them might be quite higher. So overall, the situation is such that the percentage of Russians living in the poverty level is more like 10% of the population. So it is not some historic minimum. And that's the poverty level. There is also another level above the poverty level, which is the poor population. And I don't have statistics for that, but I would be willing to bet that that has also increased quite a bit in the last few years. However, if I do find those statistics at some point in time, I will share them with you here, but that's what I have right now. I've been talking about Ukrainian drone strikes on oil refineries for a while now, and we actually got some statistics recently that show us what effect that is having on the Russian economy. Basically, the Russian economy has lost 20% of its profits from petroleum exports. And we saw this as a drop in profits from February to March. Now, it seems like it's been kind of quiet in the last week or so. We'll have to see what happens in the long term. I also have read a lot of discussion here in the Russian press, and I don't know if this is wishful thinking on their part or if this is something that is actually actively being discussed in the West and especially in the US. But here, there's a lot of discussion that the United States is not happy with the drone strikes because they're worried about gas prices increasing in an election year, which very well might be true, right? I'm not saying that that's completely hogwash. But, I mean, it does seem to be affecting Russia, and Ukraine, I think at this point in time, doesn't really care all that much what the Western powers have to say because they aren't really being supplied with the weapons that they're asking for. So we'll have to see if these drone strikes continue, but we do actually have now statistical data or economic data, I suppose, that shows that they are having 20% is a substantial drop. Lastly, it looks as though maybe the Russian central bank is attempting to start some beef with Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan. This last week, banks in both of those countries and Armenia as well as I believe, but we're going to focus on Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan. Banks in those countries began to block payments of the Russian card Mir. I mentioned this last week, in fact, if anybody watched that video. And the reason that they did that was to avoid secondary sanctions. Well, this last week, the head of the central bank, Elvira Nabiullina, she threatened extreme measures against Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan in the form of financial limitations and restrictions if quote-unquote friendly countries didn't bring these payment systems back or attempted to hinder Russian payment systems. And it's maybe not great because the Russian central bank doesn't have any real things that they can threaten these countries with. There's just nothing. And these Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan are both considered friendly countries for Russia. And here we have the Russian central bank threatening some sort of action when these countries are just kind of protecting their own necks. They're not actively doing it. They didn't make this decision of their own accord. So it's just not really a good move from the Russian central bank. I don't think anything's going to come of it, but it does seem a little like just lashing out almost in desperation. Okay, a few last things here. We're kind of going to do a lightning round. This isn't connected to politics or economics, really. The first one is this last week, there was a Russian propaganda video making the rounds online. It featured this U.S. soldier telling this whole story of how he had been fighting in the war in Ukraine and how he was applying for Russian citizenship, the kind of like good old Amerikosi, they're gonna the real ones are gonna come over here and get Russian citizenship, and Russia's the best, and they can see it. The true ones see it. Somebody did a little bit of digging on the individual in the video. It would appear that he's wanted in the United States for multiple charges, one of which involves him having explicit photos of an underage girl on his phone. This is pretty common in the last period of time when it comes to kind of Kremlin cheerleaders that they choose, foreigners who they choose to be as Kremlin cheerleaders. Almost all of the time, they have some really skeezy backgrounds, just not really traditional value type stuff. So I really hope whoever is running PR for, Team Putin, I really hope that they do a much better job of vetting in the future, because it's not a good look when you got somebody like that as your poster boy. Really doesn't make any difference, but Navalny's been dead for a month and a half now, and the government still refuses to take him off of the terrorists and extremists list. The reason for this being that they haven't received his death certificate. The Russian Rosfin monitoring organization, the ministry, they don't have his death certificate, which is just phenomenal. Just great bureaucratic work all around there on the Russian government side. So good job, y'all. Keep it up. And this last week, there was ongoing drama with rockets. In fact, the launch of the Russian Angara 5 rocket was delayed 3 times. It was delayed twice. Both times it was delayed, the delay happened at the last minute. There were some problems that were discovered right before launch happened, although the launch did finally happen on the 3rd try. Now, the Angara 5 is just the old workhorse of Roscosmos. It's been, honestly, over 20 years that they've been using this rocket, or this model of rocket, I should say. And, it's fine. That's fine. But this is not the first time, even in this year, that the Russian space program has had to delay rocket launches because of defects and problems discovered just minutes before launch is supposed to happen. And coming on the heels of the Russian space program's failed moon landing last year, the Roscosmos is just not it's just not doing very well right now. It's also doubly awkward because this last week, on the 12th of April, was Cosmonautics Day, a day here in Russia which celebrates all of the wonderful things that the space program and all of the has achieved, and everything that it has done for us here on Earth. If you're interested in checking out a little bit more about Cosmonautics Day and some places in Moscow connected to Russian cosmonautics and the Soviet space program, there should be a video here, I believe, somewhere in the corner. I made a video about that last year in time for Cosmonautics Day. So give it a watch if you want to see a little bit more of Moscow and something that's not directly news related. All right, that is a recap of most of the stuff that happened this last week. There are a few things on my notepad that I did not cover. I will try to squeeze them in later, either because I think there might be a little bit more coming to them, or because maybe they deserve a little bit more time. So I always say this. I always say I'm going to try to squeeze out another video here real fast, but that doesn't happen. If I miss it, I miss it, but I'm doing my damnedest. Anyway, I hope this has been informative. Leave it a like, leave it a comment. I like a lot of the suggestions that I've been getting in the comments. I do plan on implementing some of them, especially with regards to ideas about future videos. But yeah, for now, this has been Russia in Context. Thanks for watching.